Welcome to Long Term. I'm Ty King, and this podcast has dealt with a lot of different types of, recovery. Life is strange, and we're sold a dream of what our lives can look like as children, and saying this is what you can be in as an adult. But by the time that we get older, we've been through some things that opened up wounds and made us feel like we might not ever become that version of ourselves that we had imagined as children. And normally, if you're injured, you instinctually try to heal yourself. You might go to the doctor, you Google a remedy, you ask for thoughts and prayers on your social media friends. But with mental health, we don't have that same instinct immediately to start healing. We overlook it and we make excuses. We find something to blame for all our suffering. Healing takes a decision and action. So therapy, meditation, education are all a great medicine and mental health issues. But the most overlooked, I think, is walking side by side with someone who has been where you are and they made it through. So to know that you aren't the only one in the world who is dealing with this and that you're not alone and that you can depend on someone who's 50 steps ahead of you to walk back and then continue the journey with you side by side so that you have someone to rely on. So I'm a big proponent. We've learned so much about, peer support and recovery, not only in substance use, but in many different issues, just knowing that somebody else has gone through the same thing you have. And so, yeah, I'm excited to have, great guests on this podcast and to learn from the specialists and the experts in these fields. So today we have Breyonna Kelton, who is a peer recovery program director for the New Jersey Prevention Network. Breyonna, hey, how are you?
I'm doing good, and thanks so much for having me today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and time and just learning from you naturally. So I'm really excited to hear about it. Um, so I guess, first of all, why I always ask this question from anyone, but it's like, why get into, like you're the peer recovery program director, but it's over a prevention network. And so how did you choose that career?
That's fun. And in New Jersey, and I'm sure in a lot of places, prevention and recovery support and treatment and other clinical services, they kind of exist in these like separate bubbles. Like it's like this is recovery's over here, treatment's over here, and prevention, which is mostly focused on the messaging and the education, is completely seemingly disconnected from it all. But what we know from the work that we've done here, from what we do at the agency, that prevention really is everything. Prevention is this big umbrella over so much of the work that we do. So sometimes when people know that we do recovery specialist training and program development and supporting peers across every aspect of the work, they find it confusing. They're like, at a prevention agency, how's that possible? I thought what you guys do is say teach kids to say no to drugs and then they
Hmm.
move along, and that's it's really not the case. We do so much more than that. There's always a little bit of what are the risks associated with drug use, and that's a big component of all the work, but it's so much more than the messaging and the information. But me, why do I do this? Why did I come here? So what's amazing is I worked in higher education and I still teach in higher education. I'm a professor at a couple of different county colleges where I support education in a lot of spaces. And when I was looking to go into the public health sector, and I have a couple of different degrees in some different areas that we can chat about, I seen the listing for what NJPM was doing. I learned more about them as a public health advocate and all the work that they've done in this space. And they've been supporting public health education for over 20 years. I reached out, I was like, look, I can, work on some trainings. I can support people. I had no idea that it was in the recovery space. It was like, hey, how can you work to manage supporting people? I was like, for sure, like, this is for me. I came into this space and they're like, this is focused on recovery. This is a new training program. New Jersey had just started funding integrated services for people with lived recovery experience. And it meant starting from the very beginning of people are going to show up with their recovery experiences. They're going to be working in hospitals, doing mobile outreach, supporting people that have recently experienced an overdose. And we're going to be training them on how to do that ethically, how to do that without exploiting their traumatic experiences, and how to do that in a way that's sustainable. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is my real life. This is like my real life. I'm like, this is like what I've always done. I never got paid for it. It was just part of being a friend, being a family member, being a community member. It was just a part of sharing my experiences with other people in a way that doesn't tear me apart, right? That helps support the other person. And most importantly, that makes it about the other person. And I think, and that's the conversation we can have. I think so often people think that being a recovery advocate or recovery specialist is about getting on stage and kind of like pouring out every open wound or traumatic experience you've ever been through. People often ask about, your most traumatic drug use, or how many times have you overdosed, or how many times have you been to the hospital. And really, it's not about bleeding out for other people. It's about being a living example of hope. It's about somebody knowing that we have a shared experience. My experience, of course, looks different than somebody else's. I also identify as a Black woman, as a mother, as a daughter, as a sister, which is different than somebody else I may be supporting. So our experiences individually are going to be different. But we know from showing up how we show up in this community that we have a shared experience, which means that there are going to be things that you never have to explain to me. You don't have to explain to me that you feel fallible. You don't have to explain to me that you felt undeserving of love. You don't have to explain to me that you don't know how to restart. You don't have to explain to me that there's shame attributed to the things that you've experienced or done. And we can start with, what does tomorrow look like for you? Like, where do you want to be tomorrow? What we got going on? How do we survive tonight? How do we get to tomorrow? And then it's, what do you want your life to look like next month, next year, 5 years? Like, what's happy for you? And for so many people in those experiences, it becomes trying to figure out if they've ever experienced that. It's wild that some people have never experienced what happy could mean for them. Most people, you're navigating treatment, people never ask. They're like, you need to hurry up and become a contributing member of society. Nobody's asking, what can make you happy, because
Yeah.
there's so much of our system that's built around what the societal expectations of what recovery is supposed to look like, and not what it means to help people rebuild for them. We're looking, what do you do to make restitution? Right? You get incarcerated, it's not about building skills, wellness, wholeness. It's about, how do you make restitution to the community that you have offended in some way? And that perpetuates the lifestyles that we create. So when we come out of jail, you've been incarcerated before, you owe a significant amount of money from the time that you've been incarcerated. You are now with this new obligation to share your criminal background history with anybody that you're engaging with professionally. And then you have to wear that forevermore, right? So kind of in this winding road that I'm going down, connecting back to why it meant so much to me, is it was about the representation of people that look like me and sound like me and show up like me, knowing that it's also possible for them. I
Yeah.
wanted women, young women, Black people, Spanish people. I identify as both Puerto Rican and Black American, to see recovery in their shade, to see advocacy in their shade, to see growth and deserving of love, in their version, in their flavor, and say, okay, it's for me too. And then we can, we can overcome whatever the barriers are in supporting those people together. And I think ever since that day, like almost now 7 years ago, when I came in and very much started from the bottom. So I'm grateful to be the program director now, but there was very many of years where I was the photocopier and the book packer and the supply checker list manager before now. And it really was about just figuring out how to support people better.
Hmm.
And I'm grateful that I get to do that.
So you said several interesting things there. I want to make sure that we try to hit on on several of those before we leave here. But yeah, you make a great point where it's, if you, because there is a stigma around, using or being in recovery or like having been to prison or anything like that, where you do have to, notify professionally, let people know, hey, I've been to prison and this is what happened, or I had this issue and I got arrested and this is the thing that happened. And because of that, whenever you tell somebody, hey, now you've got to be a contributing member of society, there's probably an avatar that they see in their head of what that looks like, and that seems like unachievable, because it's like, oh, that's somebody that's never had problems in their life. That's they live in the white picket fence house, and they've got this job, they're an attorney, they're a financial or whatever it is, and so it doesn't feel like especially when there's such a stigma around people that have a history, to feel like you're going to be shunned by those people that you think are the contributing members of society. How do you redefine that? And so I would love to know that the process of what you work with when you ask people, okay, what makes you happy? And like, how are you going to get your life together?
For sure. So one of the most amazing things we do at NGPN is we develop training curriculum. And I want to give the context of that because it's very often not me and one person. It's trying to figure out how we create sustainability for a lot of people to be able to do this, right? This is not like one person with the cape out there saving the world. So for us, New Jersey funds New Jersey funds recovery specialists to exist across the continuum of care. One of the first programs, which is an opioid overdose recovery program, was about hospital-based services. So it meant if you experienced an overdose somewhere out in Jersey and emergency services were called, you go to the hospital, you're receiving emergency treatment, emergency services. Sometimes that means medication. Sometimes that means a well check. Sometimes that means oxygen, like whatever the services that are needed right then. And then a recovery specialist is dispatched to come to the hospital to be able to provide next step services. And whether that's talking the person through their options, whether that's sharing a little bit of their experience to kind of say, like, look, this is something that could be possible for you, or whether that's just sitting with them until their family member arrives and they're able to talk to somebody that they want to talk to about the service options. So there's a lot of roles that that person plays, right? So now this person, this recovery specialist, we train all the recovery specialists in New Jersey that work on these initiatives to do that work. So the first thing we do with those recovery specialists is we bring people who've been doing the work for a long time together and say, like, hey, how do we implement motivational interviewing? Right? How do we implement trauma-informed care? How do we implement harm reduction knowledge into fostering conversations that build intention? And that's like our step one, because it's very much, bust the bubble. It's not the case that you're going to walk into the emergency room. Somebody who's just experienced this traumatic medical event is going to say, absolutely, yes, I would like to go to treatment immediately. Thanks so much for popping in. One time of a million times is somebody going to be like absolutely receptive from the very first moment you engage with them, and they're going to know the kind of service provider they want, where they want to go. It's not, it's not happening that way. Very often it's the case that you're met with hesitation, which is disguised under the fear, the trepidation, the concern, or you're met with a lot of questions, around what this can mean for the person. Remember, and I'm sure that you get this, but for everybody, remember that people are attached to a lot of things. Now, you're not coming into the ED with no baggage, no concern. Often it's the case, people have children, they have households, they may have an apartment, you may have 2 dogs and a cat. There's this assumption that if you're navigating chaotic drug use, that you are absolutely floating alone in the world. And that may not be the case for everybody, right? So you're coming in, and the very first, most important thing is to understand what it means for that person to exist in their life. And it's like, you just experienced this event. It feels scary. I can imagine it feels scary. We're glad you're here. We're glad you're alive. That means a lot. I'm sure if there's no one else in the world that's missing you, if we lost you today, I'd let you know that I miss that you're not here.
Mhm.
And humanizing this moment, because the life is so valuable. Like, without knowing anything else, the life is valuable. And then we get to, how can I help you today with whatever it is that you got going on? Because then there's this other false notion that navigating treatment is somebody's first concern. I can tell you as a mother, that's not my first concern. My first concern is who's going to take my kids. It may be who's going to lock my house. It may be my car is outside. So if I do anything else right now, my car is going to get towed and I'm going to come back to what? So first, it's, what does this person's life look like right now? How can I help you with that? And sometimes the person is like, I'm on parole, I'm on probation, this is a violation for me for where I got, picked up from the emergency room. Is this other person gonna get in trouble? Am I gonna make my appointment later? And it's like, okay, this is what we're understanding to be real life, right? And as I start to become invested in what your real life is like, what happens is we build a real relationship. because I can support you through nothing if you don't first buy into the fact that I'm bought in. You come in here with your chart and your notes and your diagnosis of me, as you know, and I hope everybody's medical experience is not this way, but it's very often the case that you're just a number on a chart, and here's, you came in with these 7 drugs in your system. And most times we're not equipped to have conversations about polysubstance use, and we can kind of talk about that later. But you come in with this laundry list of drugs that you've had in your system, you've been picked up wherever, and they're just like, okay, what do you need? Oh, this service. Oh, you're feeling pain. Oh, muscle through. Do you have somebody? All right, get out of here. And then the recovery specialist comes in, and it's like, nah, I'm good. I'm good. I'm good on this. I'm good on this experience. And so I think when you're talking about how do you have that conversation about helping somebody figure out what their happy is, what their baseline, I think it's first trying to understand who they are, what their life may mean for them in that moment, you know, and what do they see as like their very first need to be met before we can cultivate some relationship building so that you can trust me enough to share those things with me.
Right. You said earlier you try not to exploit their childhood trauma, or, you know, and it seems like you're very focused on like, what do you want to be from this point forward? And yeah, a big issue, and I guess part of it is, I mean, like your prevention, right? So preventing someone from relapsing as well, does that not play a role, you know, when they have a history of like, okay, here's the signs or here are the triggers to be aware of with this person so that they don't regress?
Okay, and that's, I'm glad you kind of brought it up in that way. So you're not necessarily preventing somebody from relapsing, and you know, if somebody has a relapse or what we call reoccurrence of use, we're looking at it as how do you create a safety plan around the chance of somebody having a reoccurrence, right? Like for very many people, having a reoccurrence can be a part of their recovery process. We know that recovery is not linear. You know, we're bouncing up and down and all around here until we find what this new life looks like for us. But it's more about, and that's when we kind of talked about the trauma informed care, but also the harm reduction information. So you, and that, this is a great segue back to the polysubstance use. Say somebody's navigating opioids and stimulants, and what that combination looks like for them, and stabilization of their mornings and going to bed at night. We may say like, this feels like there's a lot going on to be getting all this information. And you're telling me, we've already had the conversation, that you're not looking to access treatment services right now. Okay, you know, this is a big step, and I'm going to make sure you have the information for it. Should you change your mind, you want to do something different tomorrow. In the middle, we're going to talk a little bit about how often do you feel that you need to be using? How often are you using, and what frequency, you know, and in what dosage, and what are the effects of that for you, you know, when you're engaging in those substances. And through that conversation, we're able to navigate what the risk factors are. And as you're contributing the information back to me on what that usage looks like, I can help to mitigate the risk as much as possible by sharing the information. So we may talk about your smoking. We may talk about where to access smoking kits. We may talk about where you're using and the importance of not using alone. We may talk about if you're engaging in sex work, how to take preventive methods to avoid STDs. We may talk about where to get emergency medical care if you have abscess that you're not getting service, that you're that aren't exposed enough to receive more services that you are in the hospital, but like, hey, you have this abscess, you're injecting around. This is what this means for the possibility of an infection. This is how you can provide wound care in this space if you need to, or when you need to, based on how it may present. This is where you can get those services. You know, if this information is overwhelming and you've got just one drop of it and you're hoping to circle back. New Jersey, for example, has harm reduction centers throughout the state. So we're working through mitigating the risk because, again, we want you to be alive to make the next decision. And then, which is very often the case, as you're starting to navigate the risk, people are able to evaluate the conversation a little bit more conscientiously. It doesn't become, I'm telling you to stop using drugs. No, it's like, okay, no, you're smoking or you're using this particular substance in the morning, you know, and you're needing to be okay. You know, you're feeling these types of withdrawal symptoms. It's affecting your body in this way. And I get that, you know, and I get how hard that is for you. And you're still trying to navigate going out into the world to engage in whatever way your life looks like, how can we make sure you're able to do that? And then we kind of work through that, and it's more often the case that people are now like, okay, cool, all of this changed my entire life, and tomorrow, yeah, I'm gonna call that number. But it is also equally the case that people are also sharing forward that information. We talk about this, like, this exponential butterfly effect, that people are sharing back forward this harm reduction information to people that they engage with, and in turn that message is sharing. So when we talk about prevention, tie back to that piece, that's a big part of it too. Being honest and truthful with the facts about drugs is so important. It's way more important than, the media propaganda of you're going to die, you're going to die, you're going to die, because that does nothing for us. Or I don't want to say nothing. I'm sure that's like the wrong thing to say. It does very little in mitigating the risk around actually using drugs. There's nobody, or there's, for the sake of factuality, I'm sure there are very few people that don't think drugs are risky in itself. I think that there's a risk assumed. I think it's about how do we mitigate the harm as much as possible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If So for someone that you're working on, like you said, you're not just telling them not to do drugs because we don't that didn't work in the first time. I'm sure that they were at school at some point and they said, just don't do drugs. You know what I mean? Well, that didn't stop you from doing the drugs in the first place.
Crack is whack, right? This is not something.
Right, right, right. Yeah, exactly. McGruff, I remember all those things. And I asked people, it's like, when the first time that you used, did you ever think about those red ribbon weeks at school or DARE program coming in there? No, they're like, no, that was a fun time. We wore pajamas at school, but that was it. Um, but yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. And I guess, for, focusing on the future, like, what do you want to be on this point going forward? Obviously that was something that worked for you because you said initially this is what attracted to you. I mean, you're an adjunct professor at the Ocean County College as well right now. So like you're also doing this other program and running it for peer recovery because you said you saw a little bit of yourself and like what worked for you. So is this the type of, approach that you took for yourself where you were like, hey, I'm going to stop and this is what I'm going to do going forward?
So my experiences were definitely a little different than most people that I engage with. But I think the changes for me, and a lot, I've experienced a significant amount of intimate partner violence in my life. And that was a particularly chaotic experience and some life-changing focus. And what helped me to understand is the idea of building community. And in building community and in having people, and in the recovery space, we talk a little bit about recovery capital. And this is kind of helpful to what I'm talking about when I talk about some changes that happened for me. When we build up recovery capital, we're pouring in like a repository, like a bank, for you to be able to pull from when you're experiencing particular personal crisis, cravings, shifts, major life events, things that may prompt a return to use or other chaotic events in your life, right? So you're essentially pouring in, pouring in, pouring in, so that should you ever need to pull from to feel better, there's something to pull from. We found, and this, like, statistically, that people, and based on, you measure recovery capital, safety and housing, the access to food, people to build relationships with, security, mental health, wellness. So we're pouring into this. We found people that have significantly low recovery capital more frequently experience recurrence to use. So we know there's science, tied to building up the capacity on the side. So for me, I had a daughter at the time. My daughter was 2. I was experiencing very chaotic wave of intimate partner violence. I was very isolated from my family. And I didn't have a steady stream of income, and I had very limited means of transportation. And I was like, "Oh, what now? What now? What does this mean for me?" My particular bottom is not knowing how I was gonna provide for my kid in a space that very much threatened, my health and wellness and safety, and was completely, like, boxed in to what my options were. And it was in sharing what my needs were, a little bit more, even if it was gonna be, um judged, and I'm going to social services and I'm finding ways to go out and apply for assistance in any way that I can get transportation or childcare so that I can be able to access getting a job. And there's so much, and I can talk for endlessly about the struggles of social services when you need them, but there's so much struggle there, but there's so much liberation in being able to put words to your experience that's the start of I'm going to be able to get help for how I feel right now. So it's like this is this challenging space, but there's so much in that. And many people don't have it, especially don't have it in their like friends and family because of, what they've experienced. But I remember there's this monumental moment for me. I had dropped out of school. I hadn't attained a degree yet. I went to Ocean County College, and that's why I ended up teaching there. But I went to Ocean County College to go back to school. And I was like, I'm gonna take a class. I'm gonna figure out a way to do this. I gotta start somewhere. I didn't I had this kid, that I needed to provide for. I didn't have a way to pay for the school. I'm trying to figure out how to take out loans. But I'm in this class and I had done so well most of the semester, from like taking the bus and bringing and finding people to watch my kid in my neighborhood and all this stuff. And finally, it's my final exam of this biology class, and thank goodness to this professor. I pull up to this class and I have my kid in the stroller. And she's like bouncing about, and I don't know how I'm gonna navigate telling this professor that I need to take this final, but I don't have anybody to watch my kid, and I came on the bus, and I don't really know what to do now, but I really try my best. And I'm like crying as I'm explaining this, because like the full weight of this like very first step rebuild, like I'm making no progress. This is one class, in the greater scheme of things, like it's not like the biggest accomplishment I've ever experienced in my life, but it's the most vulnerable one for me, of being so intentional about needing help, to this professor that like barely knows my last name. And I'm crying and I'm saying I really need to do this and I'm trying my best, and he's like, bring your kid. And I was like, okay. And I just like roll my kid into class, and he's like, just sit right there. And I'm like sitting by the door, and I took my test in like 20 minutes, and I got an A in the class, and and it was my last day ever seeing him, actually. So I owe him thanks now. But it was in showing up honestly, like with my barriers, and my struggles. It was not being ashamed of the fact that I'm there as a single mom in this class with these like 19-year-olds who are like, what are you doing here? And being honest with somebody about needing help, and saying like, I need some support right now. Like, can you
Mhm.
help me? Yes or no? And being vulnerable about that. It could have been no. It could have been too bad. You're going to fail this class, and it is what it is for you. And I was like, oh, I could do this. Like, I can like show up more for myself. Like, I'm deserving of somebody saying yes to me and recognizing that I'm doing the work, and then, offering me a hand up when I'm needing this right now. Like, I'm deserving of that. And I thought at the time, and I know now even, that I didn't ask for help all those times before. I didn't feel like I deserved it. I'm like, these are my life decisions. I chose to come here. I chose to engage in these spaces. I chose to be in these relationships. I chose to have this kid. Too bad now that it's not working out for me. I need to figure it out by myself, because I did this to myself. And it wasn't until I started to forgive myself for beating myself down, and understanding that still, even when you make bad decisions, you deserve to be cared about and loved, and you deserve for somebody to be able to support you, that you are deserving of it. You don't have to like beg and plead for it. You're deserving of it. It was like, it's like one drop in the bucket. It wasn't like all life changed, everything's good tomorrow, but
Yeah.
it was the first time I had ever gone up to somebody that didn't already know everything about me and said like, please, can you help me? And they were like, okay, cool, let's do it. And I'm sure it wasn't no major, thing for him, but I was able to understand what it meant to see somebody and support them. And I think going forward, it helped fuel why I wanted to be in a space where I could hear somebody's experience. I could hear, their events, know that, again, different from mine, but say like, I get that. You need help right now. Let's figure out how to get to the next step. And then we can work on whatever it is when we get there. So I guess that's my thing. I hope that answered the question. I'm
You
kind of
did, you did. Plus some. No, it's great. Yeah, that's incredible and incredibly helpful that when you're having people that understand, you know what I mean, or that are compassionate, show empathy and towards you, and just give you like a smallest thing is like being able to bring your kid so that you can come in and do do the work. You know, it's one thing. But it's that small thing like makes a huge amount of difference because what if he had turned you away and be like, well, you can't bring your kid in here, you know, like that would have stopped it all. Those small acts of compassion and empathy. I wanted to ask you because another thing you mentioned earlier was that one of the reasons you came into the peer recovery space is because you wanted to see, help more people than, and of course, the different minority groups as well. To come out, and so I'm just curious because I've never been to New Jersey, so I don't know what the mix is there. But I know here in Arkansas, there are so many different recovery organizations and like halfway houses and things like that that are helping, but there's only one organization in one particular area of the state that I know of that like helps the most people in the Black community because they happen to be living there, and it's not because of population, because the population here is about half and half. You know what I mean? So it's a really curious thing. But once you go to like one of these recovery houses, you'll see it's all the Caucasian people are there, and it's like you go to another one, and you go to another one, and you see the same thing over and over and over and over, and it's kind of strange. It's like I know this isn't an issue of like, well, that's just the majority of the population that lives here and they're the ones that are in recovery and so they need help and they come into this. There are people that are in minority groups that also need substance use, help. And I don't know if it's because they're not reaching out for the services because they don't feel welcome there, or like it seems like it's multifaceted of like, why aren't we serving more people in those minority groups? But yeah, I'm curious what your experience is with that in New Jersey where you are.
For sure. And I think the key thing you shared there is it's definitely multifaceted. So in New Jersey, we experience probably one of the highest levels of diversity in our state just for how densely populated we are. So we're so densely populated. There's so many different types of people, and then there's so many subcultures and those cultures. So we have like Black Americans, but then you have people who identify as African, people who identify as Afro Caribbean. So in that space of people being, every shade of brown, there's a lot of individual communities in those brown communities, which is something that we work to understand as much as possible so that the services align best with the need. And I think that's where you're starting to see this, like, I don't want to say segregation, but this separation of different culture and groups. I know in the Black community and in a lot of minority communities, there's a lot of shame in accessing services. There's and has been, and we're working to kind of chip away at that. But if you could pull a list, you could chat GPT a list of like recovery advocates, you're going to find that like 90% of them, identify as white American, and not even just white, but very much like American white people who work to ensure that the recovery and lived recovery experience is on the front lines, which in fairness we're grateful for. Having people that are advocating for a first person recovery experience is quintessential to the work that we're doing. So it takes nothing away from that. But in New Jersey specifically, it's hard to navigate the cultural nuances of the shame associated with these communities. So for example, my family, just navigating the conversation around recovery is always a big to do. Now, substance use disorders have run in my family since my family has been a family. So very much there's always people, alive that have the same blood as me that are actively navigating chaotic substance use. And even in the work that I do, and even in how long I've been in this space, I'm still going to family functions, where people are like, up. Does that mean we have to stop drinking now? We can't drink over here because you're going to tell us that, more people die from chaotic alcohol use than anything else. And I'm going to say, well, that is also true. People are dying a lot from this. I'm not going to, condemn you to hell because you're deciding to engage in alcohol. But we're working in our family structures and in our communities to help work through the shame associated with identifying as being in recovery or accessing recovery services, so that this cycle is not something that perpetuates. Very often it's the case that people of color are coming into the recovery space and finding out way later in their life that other people in their family have also navigated treatment and recovery. And they're like, hey, I thought I was alone, but actually my uncle, my cousin, my so-and-so, may have even went through the same program as I went through. And I had no idea until, somebody mentioned it way later down the line and missed the opportunity to say, look, I went to X treatment center in this county of New Jersey and it was a good experience or bad experience. And, then I went here and this was a better, inclusive, accommodating experience that spoke the language that I spoke. And here we go. I was able to access services there. I heard a phenomenal recount of a inpatient program where it was a housing program where a woman was explaining to her clinical service provider that she was encountering her brother who had passed away in a dream. And that every time she would have this dream, her brother would explain that he was okay, that he was doing great, and so and so. He had died in the way between her language that the language that she spoke, the challenge that she had in communicating in English, and kind of the creativity of the spiritual encounter that she was having in this dream, it came across that she was experiencing delusions. So the clinical provider is like, oh my gosh, my patient is not getting better. They're experiencing these very chaotic, grandiose delusions. We may need to get her medicated. We may need to get her into an inpatient mental health facility. And it's like, things are moving. They're moving very quickly. And fortunately, the clinical director of the facility had to come to the facility for this person to even receive those type of services. So they came in to clear this. And the person's like, oh no, this is this explains the spiritual presence of this, how this person engages in their faith. And often there's an aspect of that that's a part of how people experience their culture, right? So this is this person's faith. This dream that they're having on their brother is more about them accepting the passing of this family member and being in a safe space for them to be able to work through the turmoil associated with the loss, and is more positive actually than anything else that she had been experiencing in this program. So we jumped off the boat with, not we literally, but the people who are providing the services jumped off the boat with, oh my gosh, it's nothing like a culture experience they have been familiar with. This spiritual experience was something so far that they had understood. And then the language and the words that this woman was using to describe it was so far from familiar that we're about to prescribe and administer services that were attributed to somebody having a delusion, when they're simply experiencing spiritual growth in the way that works best for them. So I think that perpetuates the harm sometimes, associated with getting services by providers that don't look like, feel like, sound like you, and then contributes to the barrier of more people accessing services and saying like, you're not going to get me anyways, so why am I coming here? You're not going to understand me. You're not going to sympathize with my struggle. So what's the point? It shouldn't be that way, but let's be real about that. We're still kind of there. Fortunately, on the positive side of it, what I'm seeing in my space is that we're having a lot more people come into the space that speak other languages, that speak Portuguese, that speak Spanish, that speak Creole, and are understanding the value in those lived experiences and are coming to work in hospital and mobile outreach programs to be able to be a part of that solution. So we're not at, it is what it is, and here we are, and we got to live with it. People are consciously working to make the change. But I think the hope, and if I could plead for anything, it would be that providers who are disconnected from those communities could be intentional about building the relationship. So often it's the case that as a Black, brown, minority, non-English speaking person, that it's your obligation to educate other people in the world on here's how to engage with me. And it can't be. It can't be the way that we're putting it on everyone else to say, how do I serve you better? Like, what does this look like for you? In lieu of consciously, not as our systems, not as our individual service provider, but as our organizations are saying, wait, we are a nonprofit, we are a treatment program, we are a hospital up here. how do we ensure that people are receiving culturally responsive treatment or services from the minute they walk in the door? You know, the first time I went to access social services, I'm like screaming through like a bulletproof glass with like these little holes in the middle, trying to
Yeah.
explain why I need emergency childcare. And
Yeah.
any reason you need emergency services, chances are the reasons are bad. So if you have to explain it through a hole in bulletproof glass, it's definitely not the best experience for you to have, you know? Or even more so, a lot of the mobile outreach programs that are focused around rebuilding people who have long history of substance use disorders require you to have a birth certificate, a ID. Did you file taxes? Some sort of address verification and proof that you have no income. It's like, let's talk about cultural barriers right there, because if I'm outside on the street, what are the chances that I have my birth certificate in my pocket? So I think to kind of like fold in, I think if we are making the outreach to figure out what the barriers are to accessing services for other cultural groups, we're able to have those questions when they're not putting people's lives at risk. We talked about that woman, her life was at risk. If I'm gonna medicate you and put you inpatient in a psychiatric facility, there's a pretty good chance that there can be harm associated with that, because that's not the service she needed. So, but we're
Right.
learning your cultural barrier in the middle of you needing emergency services. That's not the time for education. The time for education as a facility would have been, we are taking in clients that identify as Haitian, that identify as Portuguese, that identify as Brazilian, whatever that culture is. We need to be well versed enough in the nuances of serving this particular population, so that if it shows up like this, if somebody is asking for a palo santo, or somebody is asking for, a specific herbs to be able to cleanse their space, we're not like, oh my gosh, this person's losing it. They're trying to cleanse the air, and then now we're in a tizzy, when that may have been a really small thing. Somebody being able to have incense in their room, or be able to have a prayer space, or be able to have an altar where they can light a candle. Those small things to create safety, in themselves, as like a first step to what this can mean to find safety out in the world.
No, that's a great answer. It kind of confirms a lot of the things, I've kind of assumed or thought, you know what I mean? It was like, well, we need more providers and to make people feel, safer, or like more understood. That you uncovered a whole different level of that, where it's like, the spiritual experiences and how they're being misinterpreted, or the language barriers. And it's like, that makes a lot of sense of why we don't see as many people of color in, recovery organizations, not to say that they don't recover, but like, it's not, they're not actively in a lot of these services. This kind of leads me up to the last question I always ask of guests, because I think this is this ties in and applies to you in your own personal story, where I always ask, what is a long-term solution? So for you in your life experience, going back to that part of, Brianna, where she was just trying to get her life together for the first time, what is something that would have helped you at the time back then that you know about now? I mean, obviously you've seen it firsthand through a lot of different people in your own experience, but what is a long-term solution that we could provide for people that were in your position back then?
And I mean, this is going to be cliche, but I think it's supporting the work that I do, like supporting recovery specialists. I think there's nothing that could have been better for me than somebody who had a similar experience than me, saying, like, this rebuilding chapter is going to be hard, but it's short, and like persevere here, because you can make it here, and here's what it looked like for me. Because there's so many times in this, and there were some significant mental health challenges for me in the middle, where I didn't feel like the end was gonna come. I was like, well, if it's always gonna be this hard, I don't know how long I can do it. And having somebody there that's like, yep, it's this hard, but it's not forever, would have been life changing for me. And that's why I advocate for first person recovery experience now, because it's not just understanding services. It's not just, navigating, does the person have insurance? Can they get to treatment? Do they have transportation? It's not just that. That's actually maybe like one of the smallest parts. The biggest part is somebody there that's saying, like, you deserve this. This can be for you. And the most impossible, hardest part you can get through, because I've gotten through it, and I'm going to be here on both sides of it, this hard part and the next celebratory part, to root for you here, and then to cheer for you when you get there, because you're going to make it. And that is why, I love the work that I do. Like, I absolutely couldn't imagine doing anything else, but I believe so wholeheartedly in sharing experiences in this way out loud, recovering out loud, so that people know that it's possible.
That's a great answer. Incredible. Thank you so much, Brianna. I really
Absolutely.
appreciate you taking the time today to talk. If people wanted to find out more about the New Jersey Prevention Network, where would they go for that?
Sure. So you can visit us online at www.njpn.org. We are a public health organization, so the services that we provide are funded by the New Jersey Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services, and we offer those services at no cost. And we also have a training institute where we offer other training opportunities to people outside of that community at cost.
Thank you again. And
Awesome.
thank you for listening. If you are watching this on YouTube, you can find us on all the audio podcasting platforms, from Spotify to Apple to iHeart, and vice versa. If you're listening to this as an audio podcast, you can find us on YouTube. You can see our beautiful shining faces on the screen. Uh, we always talk about, how it's, great. We always appreciate the subscribes and, the comments and all that stuff. But like, the most important thing that you can do to help not only this show grow, but to get the message to the people that need to hear it, is if you heard Brianna say, any of those amazing things that she said earlier today, and some great points that we've never heard in any of the other interviews that we've done. If you heard her say something, be like, I know somebody that needs to hear that. Share this episode with them. The worst they can do is not listen to it. The best it can do is change their life forever. So share this episode with someone that you know that could use this message to learn about the NJPN, to learn about Brianna's story and the things that she said about providers. I think she's provided a lot of insight. And I think a lot of even recovery institutions that are out there could learn a lot from what she just said today. And I haven't seen that. So this is great information. Thank you, Brianna, again, for taking your time and for sharing your expertise and your story.
Thank you so much again for having me.